So, welcome to Silicon Curtain. Francis, we're here in the flesh in London. It's fantastic to meet you here, and we've met a couple of times before. Could you explain to the audience what you're doing here, what your role is, what you tend to do, because you're based out of Kyiv normally?
I am based in Kyiv normally. It's great to be here, and I'm in London for a pretty unique and unusual, for me at least, event. We are holding the premiere of the documentary film about Ukrainian military medics that we made for the Kyiv Independent. It's called Can You Hear Me? And we're having our first screening as part of our second European screening tour here in London today. Yeah, very excited that we found the time to speak now before we head off to the cinema. But in terms of what I normally do in general, it's still frontline reporting, battlefield reporting, analysis, going to the front line about once a month. In fact, in February I spent most of my time out there in the Donbass, and yeah, just trying to be the best possible bridge between the battlefield and the peaceful, for now, we can say, Western world.
There must be a sense of dissonance. I mean, we'll tackle that, and then of course we'll tackle the deeper geopolitical issues that are going on, as well as what's happening potentially on the battlefield, or what at least you're able to talk about. But there must be a real sense of dissonance. You follow this every day. You follow what is happening in, say, the so-called negotiations. And here you are, peaceful streets of London, people enjoying restaurants, going out, doing stuff. And yet, when you're immersed in this, it feels like we're at the deepest geopolitical crisis since the Second World War.
Absolutely, and I mean, that's something that we feel even coming back from the front line, even just to Kyiv, where people are still living their lives, going to bars and restaurants, but here on another level, I guess, when you realize that people kind of sometimes ask, oh, what's happening in that war? Is it still going? I don't really remember. Who's winning? Where we really see a shift in the geopolitical balance that can only be described as cosmic, and that's one side of the story. But the other side is still that who is winning this war and who will really come on top on the world stage is decided at the moment on the battlefield. And in the last few weeks and months, it feels like we've been a little bit distracted from that, where we shouldn't, because that is really the litmus test. That is really the place where we understand where this war will go. Because as I try and say when I get the opportunity, peace will happen when Russia stops, first and foremost. And Russia's still moving forward, and Russia's still openly talking about how they want to move forward. And so you can think about all kinds of different formats, all kinds of different concessions, but first and foremost is still the battlefield, still a question of territory, and still an adversary, Russia, that feels like it's on the ascendant at the moment, and looking forward to going forward and taking more territory. So, you know, people think about how can we bring Russia to the table, what Ukraine will agree on, what Russia will agree on, but Ukrainians and I think those of us who understand their struggle have always said the easiest way to make Russia stop is to just make Russia stop on the battlefield first and foremost, to make them understand that with their offensive tactics of human wave, infantry assaults, basically get them to reach a point where they understand that any attempt to keep going forward will just be catastrophic, and every kilometer, every tree line will just cost far too much Russian blood, far too much money, and that's when we can really start talking about peace.
So this is going to be a multi-pronged question, and I know a lot of people don't like these, but it seems that of course Ukraine is primarily fighting for its survival. But there seems to be a high awareness, and many of my Ukrainian sort of friends and colleagues say, look, this is not just a regional war, this is not just a war about territory, this is not just a war about historical grievances. This is a global struggle, because if Russia wins in Ukraine, its ambitions are not limited to Ukraine. Do you agree with that? But also, do you get a sense that this narrative is understood properly by what one could term mainstream Western media?
Well, I mean, it's something that Ukrainians have been saying for a while, including, I remember, President Zelenskyy, not at the most recent Munich conference, but the one before, where this narrative of, oh, Europe, we need to wake up, we might not be able to count on the US in the future as a guarantor of our security, and quick, we need to scramble and do more. And then a year later, we see at the next Munich conference, that future has arrived, and there clearly wasn't enough action, there wasn't enough urgency, there wasn't enough scrambling, you could say. When it comes to the real threat, I mean, the first thing to understand is that Ukraine has been incredibly efficient at destroying Russia's military potential, and the fact that we aren't already talking about moves on the Baltics and on Moldova is only thanks to the fact that they have been effectively stopped in eastern Ukraine and not moved forward. I mean, these are arguments that we've had for a long time, I guess, but if Kyiv had indeed fallen in 3 days, then that's exactly where we would be now. And the best, and it's something I stress all the time, is that the best investment is in European security is Ukraine's security. It's simply that is Russia's primary objective. If they get bogged down to the point where they just run out of steam, they stop economic problems at home, a lack of willing manpower, willing to sign contracts, or a need to announce full mobilization. That's how you get Russia to stop not only with its ambitions in Ukraine, but with its ambitions in Europe. We know they talk about invading the Baltics all the time. They talk about Moldova. They talk about going back to Berlin. But it's very doable, actually, to stop them. And of course, the other aspect of that, why it's so crucial to stop them in Ukraine and not after Ukraine, not withdrawing to fortress NATO as the foundations of that fortress are starting to crumble. But even more importantly, I cannot stress enough on how war has completely been transformed in this war. Into a war that is dominated by drones, into a war where any single infantryman on the battlefield can be a target of multiple cheap, high-precision strikes. And it's been said a few times, but it cannot be stressed enough that NATO countries are not ready for this type of war. They are not ready for the fleet of fiber optic FPV drones that Russia is using against Ukraine in Kursk, and that Ukraine is using as well. They are not ready for what this means for military doctrine, which in many cases is stuck sometime in the Cold War. And if you think about the rich assets in terms of brain power, engineering, technology, and capable talent, not only building and then using this stuff on the battlefield, if that's lost to Russia, then Europe is in really big trouble.
Let's turn now to the battlefield, because of course one of the persistent phrases Trump has come out with is, you don't have the cards. He hasn't broken that in detail, but we can imagine the kind of conversations and briefing he's been getting, possibly even information via the Russians directly into his information thing. But it's likely he's been told that Ukraine doesn't have the manpower. It's likely he's been told they can't survive without US weapons, including heavy armor. And it's likely there are several other things that he's been told about the energy infrastructure and so on. He may even get information about the strengths of Russians. What's the reality? Because it's very easy to fall into despair. It's very easy to say, okay, Ukraine is done. But I suspect that on the ground, there's a bit of a different sense of reality.
Yeah, well, just first of all, when it comes to the statement about not having cards, I mean, it doesn't help when you're immediately taking those cards, as many as you can, away from Ukraine, including, for example, if we're talking about US systems, the Patriot, of course, is a would be a big problem to lose that to defend Ukrainian cities. But when it comes to the front line, the war has dramatically changed, even since it looked a year ago. If we go back to a year ago, we remember that Ukrainian forces were really feeling this shell hunger because of the holdup of the American aid package. And I was there, I was talking to artillery commanders saying that, yeah, we're going through our reserve and soon we just won't have any shells. And that was a big problem because artillery shells were still the main way that Russian attacks were being stopped, the main way that Ukraine was able to lay down fire. Drones were coming in at that point. FPV drones were starting to hunt Russian vehicles, Russian tanks, but artillery was still king. Now that has been flipped on its head. There was a debate in the analyst community about are drones replacing artillery, and some people, there were traditionalists and there were people who were saying that it's all going to be drones in the future. Artillery is still important as a fire asset, to be able to come and hit something hard, especially when the enemy is in shelter. But now it's simply a fact that most Russian attacks are being stopped, first and foremost, with drones. And when I say with drones, I mean with usually very skilled, professional teams, often specialist drone units, specialist drone battalions, which are now expanding to regiments, who are just so on top of their game, and they have enough drones to spend even 3, 4, 5 of these FPV, first-person view kamikazes on one infantryman. So if you think about that compared to a year ago when they didn't have that many and they were using them only for vehicles and armor, now every single Russian soldier can be hunted by multiple high-precision, cheap weapons. And that's just the FPV drones. There are also, there's a lot of very efficient work being done by reusable drones that go and just drop little bombs or drop grenades. They also serve a very important purpose, and they get also a large percent of the kills that Ukraine is recording that they get from drones. And the good thing about drones, of course, is that they are mostly made at this point inside Ukraine, almost all made in Ukraine. And the companies that used to rely on a lot of Chinese parts for their drones have now really, I've visited the factories, they are incredible. You have hundreds of 3D printers working, big conveyor belts, it's industrial level drone manufacturing. And what this means is that when it comes to the immediate frontline fires, Ukraine is actually more independent from Western aid, and especially American aid, than it has ever been before. And I don't, of course, want to underestimate the importance of that aid, again, with the Patriots, with the HIMARS, and of course, the intelligence. But in the meantime, even though you do see territory being lost, and part of that is due to the other side of the equation, which is the infantry manpower crisis, which is definitely real and not going anywhere. But still, every bit of territory that the Russians take comes at a huge cost for them. And often there are areas on the front line where the defense is so strong that the Russians are actually attacking. We just don't know much about it because they're not having any success. And so when it comes to this idea that Ukraine is going to be finished in a few months, if the aid gets cut off and it's kept and it's not restored for a while, it's simply not true, because Ukraine has always been having to fight in an environment of scarcity, lacking the shells, lacking the men, lacking the firepower, and they've always pulled through. They're at a big advantage because they're on the defensive. So it's just a question of how much the damage will be in human lives and in territory from this help being pulled. But Ukraine always retains the right to keep fighting, and now they have the ability to do so.
Does that mean that the view possibly prevalent in Washington, that the US is able to kind of call the shots and to an extent force Ukraine to either capitulate or sign up to a bad peace or sign a minerals deal at any cost. Is this a false assumption that actually they think they have far more leverage over the situation and over Ukraine than they actually do?
Well, I always say that the key factor is the balance of power on the battlefield. So, of course, at the moment we have more or less a stable front line. There are parts in southern Donetsk Oblast which are still really tough, where Russia still is moving forward every day, but compare it even to autumn last year, to November, when they were getting more territory with every month, and it seemed at the time like things were really kind of falling out of control. Since then, most of that front line has been stabilized. It does look like Ukraine will have to withdraw from the Kursk salient in a matter of days or a few weeks, but that actually might allow them to consolidate those forces and better apply them in the defense, or at least give them some rest, which I really hope they do get. But
what do we know about Kursk? Because we've been some very conflicting reports coming from there.
No, the writing's been on the wall there for a long time, to be honest. It was brilliant at the start when Ukraine first went in. It was an incredibly well organized tactical operation with great operational security. But since then, since the Russians brought the North Koreans in, and since the North Koreans got better at fighting, my friends there have told me that they're more trained and they're better adjusted to drone warfare. And even more importantly, I would say the Russians brought in some of their best drone units, including a lot of these fiber optic drones that we've been seeing over the last few months, which are unjammable. Electronic warfare, nothing of the like is going to work against them because they have a hard connection to the pilot, and the only way to stop them is with a physical barrier or by shooting them out of the sky. And these drones have been particularly useful in Kursk, and that's maybe why they were mostly sent there, because there are very few roads crossing the border. In fact, there was only one main road going into Sudzha at the start of the incursion, where the border crossing was from Sumy. The Ukrainians, since then, they had to blast some paths through the minefields to make some more roads, to give some more options for their own logistics. But still, it's a tight salient and not many roads. And when they brought in those fiber optic drones, what that meant is that basically almost every vehicle was being hit or being attacked at least by a drone. And just to give you an idea, one of the medic friends of mine who I've actually been raising money to fix their cars after these attacks, he was saying that that's the biggest problem. Just the cars are being smashed. This is whether it's an armored vehicle or just a civilian car or a medical evacuation vehicle being used. He said it's like Russian roulette, except there are 5 bullets loaded in the chamber instead of only 1. And at this point, I think it's pretty clear that there's no way to hold on, and I can only hope that the decision to withdraw is going to be made in a timely manner, and it's going to be done in a way that preserves Ukrainian lives, because that is a flaw, I would say, of the Ukrainian command. We've seen a lot of chaotic withdrawals, and let's hope this one isn't too bad, because I think it's also clear now with Kursk, and I guess people can still debate on it, but the strategic logic didn't quite pan out the way that the Ukrainian leadership maybe thought it would. They initially thought that it could draw away Russian forces from the east, which it didn't. Russia only called their bluff and doubled down on the attack on the east. And then people were saying that maybe it could be a bargaining chip. And my response to that is, for what? What could you exchange it with? In what circumstance do you really see Russia, who is hell-bent on taking a lot more Ukrainian territory and ideally destroying the idea of an independent Ukraine, in what universe do you see them saying, okay, we'll give you back this so we can get that tiny bit of land in Kursk? I think it was flawed from the outset. It would have been great as a quick raid, but now I think it's just better to focus back on the fight that's happening in Ukraine.
Has it attrited substantial amounts of Russian equipment though? Can you make an argument to say that it serves some purpose at least in degrading a lot of Russian resources and kit?
Well, I think it's hard to say for a number of reasons. We don't have the hard data, of course. And second of all, it's hard to predict the North Korean factor. It's hard to predict if they would have been brought in if it wasn't for Kursk. It made it very easy. And now if they do withdraw, are those North Koreans going to be now moving into sovereign Ukrainian territory? It's difficult to say, but I find it hard to imagine, to be honest, because it only extended the front line, and extending the front line is the last thing you want to do when your forces are so overstretched and when your brigades are not able to rotate. Ukraine is really struggling with having any kind of strategic or operational reserve units because they're just so overstretched along the front line. And of course, it's more favorable to wage better attritional fights when you're squarely on the defensive, holding a consolidated front line. So I think it will be one for the history books to kind of figure out, but I'm a bit skeptical, unfortunately.
Let's tackle two topics then. I mean, these are two separate questions, but I'll fire them both and we can go through them. One is, what attempts are being made to address the manpower problem? And to an extent, is it the excellence in drones that mean that is not, let's say, an absolutely disastrous problem, but is one that needs addressing, and I imagine there are all sorts of complications in how you address that. The other one is this topic about Russian drones, because the impression has been created throughout the war that Russia, the military has been corrupt and inefficient. They haven't learnt, and certainly in the first 2 years, they seem not to learn, and if they're officers who were keen on disseminating learnings, they were often persecuted. Let's tackle the manpower problem, and then this idea that actually Russia is learning, and this could be a major issue for NATO and Western forces.
So I think the common theme in both those questions is about where the war of drones and the war of infantry, where they intersect. Because when it comes to Ukraine's manpower problem, we talk about manpower, we talk about personnel. Someone asks, about how the soldiers' morale is doing, and it's always infantry above else. There's infantry and there's everybody else, and the infantry now is, on both sides, is fighting perhaps in the most dangerous, miserable conditions that any infantryman has fought in modern warfare, simply because they cannot anywhere on the battlefield move around within a few kilometers of the front line without being targeted by a high precision drone within a few minutes. And so when, even a year ago, the idea of an infantryman spending a few weeks or even a month at a time on these frontline positions without being switched out, that was a headline. It was a rare story, but now that's the norm, and it's just, and with that in mind, you think about how difficult it is to replace losses in a country which is still a democracy. And it's one of the most painful tragedies of the war, and of course the Russian propaganda sympathizers, you could say, will bring this up. They'll point to some videos of people being taken off the streets to say that this is where Ukraine is at the moment, like J.D. Vance did in the Oval Office, but it's just a fact at the moment that forced mobilization is the only way to get people at this point into the infantry. And so how many people, how you bring them in, how many people you can bring in, that's one side of the equation, but more important is what you do with them, and how, and can you do better to protect their lives more than anything. That's what I've been saying, that it's an issue that we're not seeing this, but truly the Ukrainian military leadership should put the Ukrainian infantrymen at the center of everything they do, preserving their lives and getting the ratio of Russian infantry losses to Ukrainian losses as high as possible. And unfortunately, that's not always done. We see systemic problems in training. We see systemic problems in the poor preparation of fortifications. We see systemic problems in the command kind of culture, which ends up in units being surrounded and not being allowed to withdraw, or units not reporting to the general staff accurate information because they're scared of being prosecuted. And it's frustrating that these things aren't being solved, and they're leading to higher losses than necessary. And I think that kind of general cultural issue was the kind of thing that led to the scandal with the French trained brigade, where soldiers were going AWOL. But it also points to the fact that the manpower problem can be solved by just being more efficient, and Ukraine might not even need to mobilize its younger soldiers. But then meanwhile you have this other vector, you could say, of the way the war is developing, with these really, really efficient drone units working on both sides. And what that means is, again, that the environment of the infantryman is more and more isolated and miserable and deadly than it ever has been. And instead of long lines of trenches like World War I, now you just have scattered little positions manned by a couple of people here and there. And sometimes the Russians can attack and dig their own holes, and things can get very confusing and overlap. But what that means is that eventually you just create this overall gray zone of confusion, which has less and less people actually alive inside it, everyone else further back, and anything that moves can be hit quickly. And now it could be a bit of an advantage for Russia over spring, that the leaves are going to come back on the trees, and that Russian forces will be able to move forward with better concealment from Ukrainian drones.
This is interesting. Armour almost certainly can't be concealed in the same way, and vehicles can't be.
Yeah, but they're being used less and less. Of course, we do still see Russians occasionally attempting small mechanized attacks and using tanks for fire support. But more and more, and now to segue to your question about the Russians, their main tactic, and it's not necessarily dumb or inefficient. It actually works pretty well. These small level infantry assaults, and it's we see Ukrainian forces capturing Russian soldiers who have just signed a contract 2 weeks ago, and they're now already on the battlefield. And the good thing about that is that Russia doesn't have the force quality for a really strong combined arms breakthrough. That's just, at this point, the beast that the Russian military has become a beast of a different character that can just push men up, whether it's on motorbikes or on foot or on little buggies,
scooters or golf carts or whatever.
We can make fun of it, but their main idea is just to get them up the field and for them to dig in, and then the next group comes and they dig in, they consolidate, then they move forward. And when Ukraine is suffering from a manpower problem, and they often don't have enough space, they have too much space between their own positions, that's where we do see these breakthroughs. But as for Russians learning and their drone program, we have seen that now they have been able to expand and scale up their drone production and innovate themselves. The same fiber optic drones that I was talking about, the Russians were actually first with that one. So
many on the Ukrainian side who dismissed that as an idea to start with.
Yeah, normally the way it goes is that the Russians cleverly copy the Ukrainian innovation, and then often get an advantage by being able to scale up production quicker than the Ukrainians can, because they've got more resources and more weight to throw around. But with the fiber optic drones, they saw that Ukrainians were getting better at electronic warfare. Every Ukrainian military car had bought, whether through volunteer or state-sponsored funds, had bought an electronic warfare unit on their car they needed to do something about it. And you know, there's also this very dystopian new development in AI drones that can target and engage on their own. But the Russians thought, well, you know what we could also do? We could have a hardwired connection between the pilot and the drone, and that has worked pretty well. Ukraine's catching up now, and we start to see some of Ukraine's best drone units using these drones very well. But yeah, it's important never to underestimate your enemy, and I think at this point, Ukraine is far beyond the point of underestimating them. They know exactly who they're facing. It's just a matter of some observers and analysts in the West to catch up.
And it sounds, to an extent, if you take the Trumpian declaration that Ukraine has no cards, it actually sounds much more like the attritional warfare or even stasis that has been talked about over the last 3 years. This sounds like technology is bringing us to the point of almost complete stasis ultimately, which means that it's not that Russia has a massive advantage over Ukraine, but actually it's going to run out of steam. It's not going to be able to conquer the 4 oblasts, which seem part of its core demands. It's not going to be able to, even if it pushes through in certain areas, have a decisive charge for Kyiv or any of those sort of traditional World War II type, you know, getting back into a war of, you know, dynamic motion, in much the same way that in the First World War, yes, they introduced tanks and so on, but again, that industrial stasis very quickly gets re-established.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be a really interesting year to watch because for now, the fundamental line that I hear from commanders is still that the manpower problem is still first and foremost in their mind, and their lack of people is the reason that they're losing territory. And unfortunately, what that means is when you lose your infantry positions because your infantry maybe ran out, and then the Russians can move forward, and then suddenly your very efficient drone units, for example, they have to retreat as well because now they could come into a firefight themselves. And so that's what we saw in the second half of 2022, where Russia was speeding up. They were taking more territory at a time in each month, and in general, a lot of the front line was in a general state of chaos where not only there weren't enough combat effective infantry, but everyone else was constantly shuffling back, and the overall ability to defend fell as a result. And so it's really good to see that a lot of that has now come back under control, but you know, it's too early to tell how that trajectory will go over this year. It's too early to tell how the intelligence being cut off will be affected. Can Ukraine solve its manpower shortage? How the spring weather will affect Russian attacks? Because
Starlink, there's the anticipated switching off of Starlink at some point.
Which would be pretty bad if it happened instantly, but Ukraine is working on alternatives, and each individual unit is working on alternatives. I mean, just the stalemate narrative is a bit dangerous because it sometimes betrays the fact that Russia's aim is, even if it's not taking territory quickly, Russia's aim is to break the Ukrainian military's ability to defend along those hundreds and hundreds of kilometers of front line. And that's what a war of attrition looks like, and that's first and foremost a war of attrition for the Ukrainian infantrymen. For the Russian infantrymen, well, we understand that they're expendable, but for now, until we see these signs, I mean, we've seen them up there, sign-up bonuses, and there are signs that over 2025 they will struggle to bring in as many contract recruits as they have done so far, which could cause problems for them. But Russia is a dictatorship, and if Putin really needs to announce a broader mobilization, it's totally possible. I don't think we'll see the Russians in the street against that anytime soon. So I think we're in this strange, very strange state of flux, but it's definitely right, first and foremost, to focus on the battlefield and to understand that Ukraine has still got plenty of fight in them.
And that's just two questions I've got left, which kind of launch off from what you've just said there. The first one is there seems to be another assumption in the White House, almost certainly fueled by weaponized information that's not true, that the bulk of support for Ukraine has been provided by the US, both militarily, economically. But of course, if you look at the figures, overall Europe has played a significant role, and not only will continue to do so, but actually because of Trump's attitude, there may well be a significant spike in not just European support, but also, let's say, dusting off of the European military-industrial complex, a scaling up of that production. That's the first thing. And then the last one, of course, is to address the manpower issues. This has been a conversation for a couple of years now, and it seemed that one of the breakpoints with Zelenskyy was precisely this. He wanted to move further, faster and deeper with recruitment to address some of the systemic problems. But as Ukraine, being a democracy, needing to be mindful not to sort of waste its people, especially with the sort of, let's say, a future demographic crisis potentially, I can see why that argument is so difficult. So let's tackle Europe's role in Ukrainian resilience and not having to buckle under duress from the US. And then lastly, what needs to happen and what difficult decisions need to be taken to get more people into the ranks of the infantry.
Sure. I mean, when it comes to Europe, I think a lot of people in Ukraine definitely saw some kind of silver lining into when they saw the deterioration of communication with Trump, in the sense that now we do see a different Europe. We see Europe waking up. We see Europe using different language and potentially looking at solutions that are actually brave and outside the box. And when I say bravery, I think it's important. I was at the EU Council just a few days ago in Brussels, where there was nothing groundbreaking, but you could see things are being slowly set in motion in terms of financial support for Europe's own defense industry and spending, and also for Ukraine's support. And of course, the braver decisions that might need to be taken, they'll be taken on more of a ad hoc basis from this coalition of the willing. But I think it's important now to focus on the fact that it's one thing to have all of these discussions about boots on the ground, for example, where when we first heard Macron say something about it, then Starmer say something about it, what was it, a month ago or so, it seemed, the assumption was always that this is something that Europe could play their role in securing the peace after everyone has gotten together and, backed by the US, Russia and Ukraine have agreed on everything, and then Europe comes in. But I think it's fundamental for Europe to now understand that those circumstances are a fantasy. We see an alignment of the US and Russia, and when we talk about boots on the ground, when we talk about something like a sky shield, this is about real bravery that might need to come without that US backstop, that almost certainly will need to come without that US backstop, and might need to even start to happen.
Maybe in the teeth of US objections even.
Exactly, before a ceasefire. So it's good to see that change. It's difficult, I guess, to understand the timeline of how things are going to go, because with these talks coming up in Saudi Arabia, for example, it's confusing to try and understand how much there still is to gain from really trying to flatter Trump and keep him saying nice things, but I really just doubt that that's going to result in a resumption of aid flow, for example. But we'll see. As for the manpower problem, I think again the mobilization is always going to be the most difficult, most painful, most tragic internal challenge of Ukraine during the war. I mean, the biggest tragedy is the loss of people. And when there seems to be such a direct pipeline from someone being forcibly mobilized to sent to the infantry and put in these really horrible conditions, there's no easy solution. Again, it needs to come with the fixing, the recognizing and fixing of systemic problems inside the military, so that the people that are considering to enlist, or the people that may be hiding from the recruiting officers, at least they don't have this image. Maybe it's too late for this, but they shouldn't have this image that their lives are being lost unnecessarily. That's what a top commander said to me recently, that he has no doubt that most Ukrainians in the military are ready to die for the country, but they're not ready to die in vain. They're not ready to die because of stupidity from the command. So that needs to change first and foremost, and we see now a new effort to improve voluntary recruiting for 18 to 24-year-olds. And the other big role, obviously, to play is innovation, and just expanding this innovation that they're doing with drones, so that more and more, it seems like still a bit of a fantasy, and it might be, but more and more so that drones can fight instead of infantry.
Francis, what an incredible summary of what's going on. We could probably talk for several hours more, but this is extraordinary information which we rarely get access to. People who've been to the front recently, people who talk with battalions and soldiers. If people are not familiar with your work, and many will be on this channel, but if they're not, I strongly encourage them to read your columns and your videos from the front, and reporting on Ukrainian politics, as well as the work of your colleagues at the Kyiv Independent. Francis, thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. It's been great.